homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma and the Sangha. Today we're looking at the story of Visakha, so a very prominent lay disciple, female lay disciple of the Buddha, who was known for her generosity and her tireless giving. So she seems like a very good role model for us to emulate and to look into to see how she actually lived. So what's said about Visakha is that she was born into a family that was known to have done very, very meritorious deeds in their past lives, and they've done that together. So in this present life, she was born to a family. Her grandfather was named Mendika. And the story goes with Mendika is that in his earlier life, during a time of famine, so a time where there was no food or not much food in the country, he had given the very last provisions or the very last things that he had in his pantry cupboard, and what was for his family, he gave it to a Pacceka Buddha. And so that's an enlightened being who is not necessarily teaching, but has fully awakened. So as a result of sacrificing the food that would have been for the family, and they gave it up for this Pacceka Buddha, they accrued so much vast merit. So they call that sometimes supernatural merit, because it's just so immeasurable in many ways. And particularly because it was during the time of a famine when there was not much food at all. So what happened was he wasn't alone in giving that dana. His wife was also involved in that, his son and his daughter-in-law, and also the servants at the time, the helpers that also were part of the household. And so that resulted in a great deal of merit in the present life. And so Visakha's family, in this particular life, she was the daughter of a man called Dhananjaya, and his wife was Sumana Devi. So those were her parents. And they were all part of this very big dana. So what is said about Visakha was, apart from this story about coming into the family of this, collective goodness, she had 100,000 eons ago, at the time of Padumuttara Buddha, she had made the intention or the aspiration. Her goal was to become the chief donor of a Buddha and the Sangha. And so she did a lot of good deeds in many, many lifetimes in order to accumulate almost like the parami, the special perfections, in order to be such a great disciple of the Buddha. And so when she was born as Visakha, that had matured. Like it was about time that the conditions were right to yield that fruit. So the story goes that when she was 7 years old, the Buddha had arrived in the city where she was living, which was called Bādhiya, and he came with a great retinue of monks. And so when her grandfather had heard that the Buddha was visiting, he called for his granddaughter, Visakha, and said to her, "Dear granddaughter, this is a very happy day for us. Go to the city and meet the teacher." That's what he called the Buddha, the teacher. "And bring all your maidservants with you." So she had a lot of helpers and people that would accompany her. Go out and meet him. So she obediently did as her grandfather had asked, and she went up to the Blessed One. She paid respects, and with her group of people that had come with her, the Buddha then gave a Dhamma talk. And at the end of the Dhamma talk, it said that Visakha entered the stream. So you know how we were talking about stream entry, that dānakathaṁ is very important. So he must have given, it doesn't say what kind of talk he gave to Visakha, but he gave a lengthy Dhamma discourse. And so when she listened, she entered the stream. So her grandfather was also there, listening to the Dhamma, as was Visakha's parents. And so they all entered the stream, as did the helper that was also part of their group from previous lifetime, was also there. So the story goes that eventually she grew up and she eventually married a person from another noble family from another city. And the story goes that there's a very long story about how they met and the conditions, but her husband's name was Punavardhana. And so they got married, and eventually Visakha moved to where he lived, which was this city called Sarakhetha. And because of her good qualities, her generosity, her kindness with her words, all these really lovely qualities that she had, and she was also very beautiful apparently as well. So because of that, whoever she met, they liked her immediately. They wanted to be around her, and they were blessed by her presence. So when she got married, her father, Dhananjaya, gave a huge dowry. So he gave lots of carts full of silk and gold and silver, whatever was the wealth of that day, he gave to her, and he gave her lots of helpers. And apparently it was said that there were many people that lived in their city of Bhatia that wanted to go with her when she got married, to go live in this new place. And so when she arrived to Sarakhetha, she came with people that had followed her, as well as lots of this wealth that her father had given. So there were cows and people and all the wealth that he had given. And so it's so large that you could see that the abundance of the wealth that she carried with her and the goodness that she carried with her was representative of all the goodness, all the generosity that she had given, everything she had given up in previous lives. Now, when you think about Visakha in this way, you can actually, the mind can get so happy, like when you actually read the words from the sutta. And at the moment what I'm reading from is the Great Women Disciples of the Buddha, a translation. So when you read it, you remember all these good things that Visakha has done and the blessings of that. The mind gets very happy. So when her father gave her leave to go to her husband, he gave her instructions, and generosity was something that he always said to keep with her, that the virtue of generosity was something that needed to be at the forefront of her mind, at the forefront of her actions, her speech. And so when you read the rest of her life, you saw that that is entirely true, and someone who had developed the parami of dana, it's easy to see how it flows through her. And so that's something that we can take as a really good quality, that rather than having a mindset, how sometimes we can feel more selfish, more stingy, rather than having that mindset, allowing generosity and giving to really flow, just like Visakha. And then our lives will also become much more wholesome and much more easy in many ways. Sometimes we don't realize that, but when we are generous, when we give up for others, there is a lightness to the way that we live our lives. It's not so self-absorbed, it's not so difficult, and it's counterintuitive. And what that means is it goes against what sometimes people tell us to do, or what we get from the TV or books or things like that. They're always telling us to save and to do certain things. And there's a certain amount of saving we can do, but at the same time you see with someone like Visakha, and we'll see this also with Anathapindika, giving is a really good thing, and wealth tends to come to those who are generous. For very good reason we can see, and particularly when we listen to the other stories of Visakha, that in the Anguttara Nikaya you see that the Buddha proclaimed Visakha as the foremost of my female lay disciples as a donor. So this is Dayaka in Pali, that's someone who supports the Buddha Dhamma Sangha. So she was generous, very generous with the Sangha, and very generous with all the people around her, always care and concern for animals, for human beings, and the Sangha. So very noble qualities. Now there's an interesting story about Visakha's father-in-law, And at the time, he wasn't following the teachings of the Buddha, and instead he was following the teachings of these company of naked ascetics. And so he would invite them to his house for alms. And Visakha didn't know about this. And so at the time he was saying to Visakha, and before she had known who they were, he said, come Visakha, my daughter-in-law, come and pay respects to these arahants. So he was calling them enlightened beings. And so she had expected, when she heard the word arahants, she expected to see the Buddha and the noble Sangha. And so when she heard that, she hurried to the hall. But when she saw that there were these naked ascetics, so these were the people that practiced in a particular way, but they didn't wear clothes, she was actually quite upset, because she wasn't used to seeing that. She was a refined lady and she didn't want to see that. And so she quickly looked away and she reproached her father-in-law. So in a way she said to him that she wasn't going to entertain them because they were naked, and also because it wasn't fitting for her to do so. And so she left. And so these naked ascetics who were practicing different practices, they took offense. And so they told Migara, why did you bring this student of the Buddha into your house? And they wanted him to turn his daughter-in-law away. But Migara managed to pacify them, and so he offered the meal and then they left. And so one day Migara was eating his porridge or his kanda, and a Buddhist monk, one of the disciples of the Buddha, came to the house and was there waiting to see whether there were any alms to be offered. And Visakha was there looking after her father-in-law, and she stepped to the side so she could allow Migara to see that there was a monk there, and to give Migara, her father-in-law, the opportunity to offer dana. But he saw, but he pretended not to notice. So he essentially ignored the monk that was standing there and kept eating. So Migara kept on, and then Visakha told the monk, please pass on, Venerable Sir, my father-in-law is eating stale food. So she was saying that as an excuse. And so Migara, her father-in-law, was very upset. And at that point, he felt ashamed, to be spoken about in that way, and also angry. And so he wanted to throw her out of the house. But the people that had come with Visakha had counseled him not to do that, because she was actually the one that was blameless. So after that incident, Visakha wanted to leave and return to her parents. But Migara asked forgiveness. And so Visakha, it's very difficult for someone to apologize. So she decided to stay, but she decided to stay on the condition that she would be allowed to invite the Buddha and the monks to the house to offer dana. And so Migara gave his consent. He said, okay, yes, you can invite them. So he didn't actually want to see them. He didn't want to offer anything directly by his own hand. So he was polite. He greeted them and then he left when the Buddha had arrived with the Sangha. But he concealed himself behind a curtain. So he was eavesdropping. And the Buddha was delivering a sermon, like giving a teaching after the offering of food. And Visakha and the rest of the household were listening, and Migara was hiding behind a curtain, pretending not to be there, but really he was secretively listening. So as he listened, the Buddha's words moved him very deeply. And so he came out of his hiding spot. And then what happened was, as he listened, he entered the stream. So he had so much gratitude at that moment that he told Visakha that from now onwards he would respect her like his own mother. And that's why she got the name Migara's mother, because her father-in-law was so touched by the fact that she had so much goodness and Buddha's teaching was so profound. And so at the end of that, that's why sometimes we hear Visakha, Migara's mother. So after that, he took refuge in Buddha Dhamma Sangha, and he bowed bowed and paid respects. And then the next day, Visakha also invited the Buddha for a meal. And on that occasion, her mother-in-law entered the stream. And so from that time onwards, the whole family had entered the stream, and they were huge supporters of the Buddha and the Sangha of monks and nuns. So it's a very, very uplifting story, because you can see that a person who is stingy, who has different views, they can turn around when they really open up. And so when we listen to these teachings by the Buddha, the gradual teachings, that is also something that can happen with us. That when it comes to stream entry, it doesn't matter whether you're young, you're medium-aged, or you're older, it can happen at any time when the teachings of the Buddha's actual words, they penetrate into our minds, into our hearts, then it is possible. And what we know about stream entry is that we remove the great danger of immeasurable dukkha. And so that's why it's very important. So Visakha, we know she was a very, very generous person. And so the saying of the Buddha at the end of this particular story was, just as many garlands can be made from a great heap of flowers, thus many meritorious deeds can be done by one who is born. So essentially, when you have a lot of flowers, you can make lots of garlands, a lot of things that you can put in a nice decorative way. The same way Buddha's using that example by saying, when we are born, we have so many opportunities to do good deeds, to be generous, to give up for others. And so the Buddha's always counseling that nothing ever really goes wrong when you give. It's always on the side of wholesome, skillful kusala. And so that's something that we must remember. So we also have another story that's accompanying this Dhammapada verse, and it's basically saying that Visakha, she gave birth to 10 sons and 10 daughters, and each had children and grandchildren, and so she was very, very fortunate in terms of her lay life. And one day she went to Jetavana monastery with her entourage, or her group of people that were with her. And when she came to the monastery, she took off her cloak, and her cloak was very heavy, and so she asked the maid to look after it. And unfortunately, the maid was a bit absent-minded. She forgot, so she left it in the monastery. And then what was the custom at the time was that Venerable Ananda would look after those things that was left by a lay disciple. So Visakha sent the maid back to the monastery to look for the cloak. But if Venerable Ananda had already found it, then keep it there, don't bring it back. And so she actually gave it up. So Visakha actually gave it up if it was already in Venerable Ananda's possession. So at the time, what she decided was she would sell that cloak and donate the proceeds to the Sangha. But at the time, there was no one that could actually afford the cloak that she had. So she bought it back with her own money. So Visakha, as we know, she was very wealthy due to all her parami from previous lives. So with that money, she decided to build and offer a monastery to the Buddha and the Sangha. And so that monastery was located on a land that was known as the Eastern Part. And so that's where Pubbārāma comes from, the name of the monastery. And so it was right before the city gates of Savatthi. There's also the name Nigaramatu Pasada, and that's also a name that's been given to that place, called the mansion of Migara's mother. And so when we read certain suttas, you hear that name a lot because Buddha had stayed there. In the last 20 years of his life, he frequently stayed there, just as he frequently stayed at Jetha's Grove, which was offered by the other chief donor, which was Anathapindika. So on the day that she was offering the monastery, the newly built monastery, she called her family to her and she told them that her wishes had been fulfilled. So she had nothing more. She didn't desire anything more because she was offering this massive donation and monastery to the Buddha and the Sangha. And so she recited 5 verses and she went round and round the newly built monastery. And so the bhikkhus, they heard her and thought she was singing. And they went to the Buddha and said that Visakha had changed. She's not like she was before. And so they asked the Buddha, has Visakha lost her mind? Has she gone a little bit, mad or off? And the Buddha replied, no. Today Visakha had all her wishes of the past and present existences fulfilled. And on account of that sense of achievement, she was feeling elated and contented. Visakha was just reciting some verses of exaltation. She certainly had not gone off her head. Visakha, throughout her previous existences, had always been a generous donor and an ardent promoter of the Dhamma, of successive Buddhas. She was most strongly inclined to do good deeds and done much good in her previous existences, just like an expert florist makes garlands from a collection of flowers. And so that's also where this saying of the Buddha has come from, that when you have many garlands, you can make them from many, many flowers. And just like good deeds, when you're born, you have that opportunity. So again, this emphasis from the Buddha, and we see the noble qualities of Visakha. And so it's something that we can emulate. She's a very, very good example for us because she was a lay person. She lived a lay householder life. As we've heard, she had many sons, many daughters, so she would have had a lot of work to look after. Yes, she would have had helpers, but by the accounts of the stories, she worked very hard all of her life for all the things that she did to look after her family, to look after the Buddha, to look after the Sangha. And she did that with so much energy, like she never tired out. And what is also said about her, she always had the look of someone who looked 16 years old, all of her age, which is quite remarkable. But when you hear about her parami and her generosity, you understand why. That this is the blessings of that over many, many lifetimes. If you're familiar with the story of Visakha, then you remember her as being the grandmother who lost her grandchild. So she was very, very upset when she went to see the Buddha. And of course there was tremendous sorrow because this particular granddaughter, Data, had been the one that helped her to serve alms, give dana to the Sangha. And so when she went to see the Buddha, she was aching in her heart. And so she went to the Buddha seeking some comfort in terms of kind words and counsel, teachings. And the Buddha, out of great compassion, said to her, or asked her, whether if she had the opportunity, she wanted to have more grandchildren or more children. And at the time, Visakha, she happily said yes, I would. And so then the Buddha said and asked her, but how many people in our city, so they were living in the city of Savatthi, how many people in this city pass away every day? And so Visakha, she thought about it and she said, but Lord, in Savatthi 10 or 9 people, maybe 5 or 3 people, maybe 2 people, but at least one person dies every day. Savatthi, our city, is never free from people passing away. And so then the Buddha asked her whether she would have sorrow or would she not have sorrow if this was the case. And so she had to admit that if this were the case, then she would have sorrow every single day. And so the Blessed One said, those who have 100 loved ones have 100 sorrows. Those who have 90 will have 90 sorrows. Those who have had 5, 4, 3, 2, until even if you have one loved one, you would experience sorrow. But those who have no loved ones have no sorrow. These alone, I say, are without sorrow, without suffering, without desperation. So what you see from that is Buddha's wise counsel. What he's saying is that when you have affection, sorrow is born. From affection, fear is born. One free from affection is without sorrow. From where would fear come? So it's a very, very deep teaching, and it's something that one needs to think about quite deeply. Because when Buddha asked that question of Visakha, Buddha's really asking her about attachment. If we get attached to people, then we are going to experience sorrow. It's like he's saying that is the formula, like a maths equation. So he's counseling not to always want to have more loved ones. So it doesn't mean you fling your loved ones away, the ones that you have in your life right now. You honor and respect them and you take care of them. But he's saying choose very wisely when it comes to knowing the more loved ones we have, the more affection we get, we have to experience sorrow because they'll die. So the same thing applies to pets. When we get a new pet, after many years or maybe even in a short time, if they pass away, we immediately go to sorrow. And what we do is we fear when death is coming for them. So it's a very, very profound teaching. And one that is really curious, because people often think, if Visakha was a stream enterer at the age of 7, surely she would not experience sorrow. Surely she wouldn't go through so much suffering. But the fact of the matter is that despite being a stream enterer, if your mind is not lifted, so the Dhamma is not very clear with you at that time, so you're what they call the fruit of the stream entry, if that is not at the foremost of your mind, then you can actually experience sorrow. You can experience these things. So the palacitta, the mind that has the fruit of stream entry, needs to be up. That means you understand all the fruits of the stream entry at that point. So you may not understand this at the moment, but if your parents are listening, what that means is that the fruit of stream entry is knowing that this body is not me and mine, and also the other person's body is not me and mine. It's not to be taken as mine. So when the stream entry palacitta is up, that knowledge, that knowing is there. But when it's down, then the attachment to these things is there. And so you will fall for it just like any other person. So that's why it's very important to keep the mind, the Dhamma, at the forefront of the mind, and so you don't fall. So Visakha is just demonstrating that for us. So again, she's a stream enterer, a lay householder, but she could also fall for that. And so with Buddha's kind words, she woke up to that. She understood. The minute Buddha said that about fear and sorrow and attachment, affection for her loved ones after the loss of her granddaughter, she understood. The final story that we can go through together of the many stories of Visakha is this one, and it's about her request to the Buddha. She requested 8 things from the Buddha, and initially he wasn't going to grant them, but she gave her reasoning for it, because it wasn't for herself, it was actually for the Sangha. As someone who made offerings to the Sangha, she noticed a few things that were difficult for the Sangha, and so she wanted to make it more easeful. So she requested the ability to offer robes during the rains, the vasa. She wanted to be able to offer food for newly arrived monks. She also wanted to be able to offer food for monks who were going out, setting out on a journey. And she also wanted to be able to offer medicine for sick monks, food for sick monks, food for monks tending the sick, and then to be able to do a regular distribution of rice gruel, so porridge or kanda. And the last one was being able to offer bathing robes for nuns so that they could bathe in the river with some modesty. So she gave the explanation of the reasoning why she wanted to offer these things, and essentially it was to make it easier and more suitable for the Sangha in all the things that they were doing. And so after the Buddha had explained, the Buddha actually asked her what are the inner benefits that she would receive as a result of him granting these requests. And basically he wanted to figure out whether she knew the distinction between outward acts of generosity and the internal training of the mind. And so this was her reply. I'll read out what is in the suttas. It says, "As to that, Lord, bhikkhus who have spent the rains in different regions will come to Savatthi to see the Blessed One. They will approach the Blessed One and question him thus, 'Lord, the bhikkhu named so-and-so has died. What is his destination? What is his rebirth?' And then the Blessed One will tell how this one had reached the fruit of stream entry, this one once returning, or of non-returning, or of arahantship, then I shall approach the bhikkhus and ask, Lords, did that bhikkhu ever come to Savatthi? And if they answer that he did, I shall conclude that surely a rains cloth has been used by that bhikkhu, or visitor's food, or food for one going on a journey, or food for the sick, or food for the sick nurse, or medicine for the sick, or morning rice gruel. When I remember it, I shall be glad. When I am glad, I shall be happy. When my mind is happy, my body will be tranquil. When my body is tranquil, I shall feel pleasure. When I feel pleasure, my mind will become concentrated. That will bring the development of the spiritual faculties in me, and also the development of the spiritual powers and the enlightenment factors. This, Lord, is the benefit I foresee in asking these 8 requests of the Perfect One. And so Visakha was demonstrating that she understood that it's not just the external offerings that she was requesting the ability to give to the Sangha, but internally she would delight in her mind. There would be abundant happiness. She would be able to concentrate the mind, and she would develop all those things, the spiritual faculties, the powers, the enlightenment factors, all those things that would help her to progress on the path of the Buddha's teachings. And so she's someone that, you understand, she wasn't giving just for the sake of giving. She was giving also to walk this path, the path that we are learning, this gradual path where Buddha is giving us instructions that we begin with dana. So there's much that we have been through today that shows us how this particular laywoman thinks, how she lived her life, a life of giving. So she still had household responsibilities, she still had her own work and things, she still had a family to care for, but she made time to be generous with her community, but also with the Buddha Dhamma Sangha. So very, very noble person, someone with really good qualities. So that's the story of Visakha. Now that we've come to the end of the session, my young friends, we can share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Wishing you well. Theruwan saranai.